Intent in tort law does not require malice or ill will. The defendant must desire the consequences of the act. Alternatively, the defendant must know the consequences will result with substantial certainty. This is the definition of specific intent for intentional torts. The doctrine of transferred intent applies to 5 traditional torts. These torts are battery, assault, false imprisonment, trespass to land, and trespass to chattels. Intent transfers between these 5 specific torts. Intent also transfers between different victims. For example, a defendant intends to hit A but hits B instead. The intent to commit battery against A transfers to B. If a defendant intends to frighten A, which is assault, but accidentally touches A, the intent transfers. The intent to commit assault satisfies the intent element for battery. This rule ensures liability even when the target or the resulting harm differs from the plan. Battery requires 4 elements: an act, intent, causation, and contact. The contact must be either harmful or offensive to the plaintiff's person. Harmful contact causes actual injury, pain, or physical impairment. Offensive contact violates a reasonable person's sense of personal dignity. The standard for offensiveness is objective. It is based on what an ordinary person would find offensive. However, if the defendant knows of the plaintiff's particular sensitivities, the standard changes. The plaintiff does not need to be aware of the contact when it occurs. For instance, an unauthorized surgical procedure on an unconscious patient is battery. This tort protects the right to bodily integrity. The contact element of battery extends beyond the plaintiff's physical body. It includes anything connected to the plaintiff's person. This includes clothing, a purse, a cane, or an object the plaintiff is holding. Causation requires the defendant's act to be a substantial factor in bringing about the contact. The defendant is liable for all resulting damages. This liability applies even if the extent of the injury was unforeseeable. This principle is known as the eggshell skull rule. The eggshell skull rule applies to all intentional torts. Nominal damages are available even without actual physical harm. This recognizes the violation of the plaintiff's right to bodily integrity. Punitive damages may also be awarded if the defendant acted maliciously. Assault requires the plaintiff's reasonable apprehension of immediate harmful or offensive contact. Apprehension is the expectation or anticipation of contact, not necessarily fear. The plaintiff must be aware of the defendant's act and the threat at the time it occurs. The contact must appear imminent to satisfy the element. Threats of future harm are insufficient to constitute assault. The defendant's apparent ability to carry out the threat is sufficient. This is true even if the defendant lacks the actual ability to cause harm. Words alone generally do not constitute assault. Words must be coupled with an overt act or surrounding circumstances. These circumstances must create reasonable apprehension of imminent contact. Assault protects the plaintiff's mental tranquility from the threat of physical harm. Battery protects the plaintiff's physical integrity and bodily safety. A defendant can commit assault without committing battery. This occurs if the defendant swings a punch and misses the plaintiff. Conversely, battery can occur without assault. This happens if a victim is hit from behind without any warning. Conditional threats often negate the imminence requirement. For example, stating, "If you take one more step, I will hit you," is usually not assault. However, if the condition demanded is unlawful, the threat remains actionable. The plaintiff is forced to choose between submitting to an illegal demand or suffering the threatened contact. False imprisonment requires an act by the defendant, intent, causation, and the plaintiff's confinement to a bounded area. Confinement means the plaintiff's movement is restricted in all directions. Blocking only one path while others remain open is not false imprisonment. The defendant must intend to confine the plaintiff. The plaintiff must be aware of the confinement at the time it occurs. Alternatively, the plaintiff must suffer actual harm from the confinement. A reasonable means of escape negates the confinement element. The escape route must be known to the plaintiff. Furthermore, the escape must not involve danger, humiliation, or risk of injury. The bounded area can be very large. However, the plaintiff must be restricted from leaving the defined area. Confinement can be achieved through physical barriers or physical force. Direct threats of force against the plaintiff are sufficient. Threats against the plaintiff's immediate family or property also constitute confinement. Confinement can also result from the invalid assertion of legal authority. This is commonly known as false arrest. Moral pressure or threats of future action are insufficient to establish confinement. The shopkeeper's privilege provides a defense to false imprisonment. A merchant may detain a suspected shoplifter. The detention must be for a reasonable time and in a reasonable manner. The merchant must also have a reasonable belief that theft occurred. Detention exceeding a reasonable time or manner constitutes false imprisonment.
Consent is a complete defense to intentional torts. Consent can be express, given orally or in writing. Implied consent arises from custom, usage, or the plaintiff's conduct. Participating in a contact sport implies consent to ordinary contact. Consent is invalid if obtained through fraud or duress. It is also invalid if the plaintiff lacks the capacity to consent due to age or mental state. Self-defense is privileged when the defendant reasonably believes force is necessary. The force must protect against imminent harm. The force used must be proportional to the threatened harm. Deadly force is only justified to prevent deadly force. Defense of others follow similar proportionality rules. Defense of property also requires proportional force. Deadly force is never permitted merely to defend property.